The bustling chaos of JFK International Airport surged around Sarah Chen as she stepped into Terminal 4. Towing her sleek, designer carry-on bag, dressed comfortably in a pair of black yoga pants and a loose gray cashmere sweater. Sarah's appearance was as unassuming as her ponytail and bare face. At 35, she didn't feel the need to announce herself as the founder and CEO of Sires Shield Technologies, a cybersecurity giant worth $4.2 billion. Today, she was just another traveler, blending into the early morning crowd. Though she could easily have taken her private jet, Sarah made a point of flying commercial when she could. She believed that grounding herself in real-world experiences helped her stay in touch with the lives her company impacted. It was a quiet source of pride that her technology was out there, solving real problems for everyday people. She arrived at the gate for Flight 2317 to San Francisco, where business travelers in crisp suits tapped away on their laptops and tired families wrangled restless children. Sarah took a seat near the corner, already lost in her emails, mentally preparing for her upcoming speech at a major tech conference. Around her, voices chattered, footsteps hurried, and announcements blared a symphony of the airport's morning rush. First-class passengers for Flight 2317 to San Francisco. Please proceed to the boarding line. Sarah stood, gathering her belongings, and joined the line of well-dressed passengers. As she moved forward, she felt a few lingering stares. The glances were subtle but familiar, older men in designer suits taking stock of her, visibly wondering if she'd wandered into the wrong line. Sarah kept her focus forward, her calm demeanor betraying no sign of discomfort. Once inside the plane, Sarah settled into seat 2A, tucking her bag neatly below the seat in front of her. She glanced around the first-class cabin, noting the flight attendants preparing for departure. Most of them appeared professional and friendly, but one stood out. Rebecca Mills. Her name tag gleamed beneath a platinum blonde bob, as perfect as her steely posture and the sharp, practiced smile that stopped just shy of reaching her eyes. Senior by rank and presence, Rebecca moved with a deliberate, clipped efficiency through the cabin, offering warm greetings to each passenger. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you anything to drink?" Rebecca asked a businessman across the aisle, her voice dripping with polite charm as she took his jacket. Sarah observed silently as Rebecca continued making her way down the row, ensuring every passenger had a drink, a warm smile, and their coat properly stowed. Yet when Rebecca reached Sarah, she breezed right past her without even a glance, her smile fading as if Sarah had become part of the scenery. Curious, Sarah pressed the call button, wondering if Rebecca's lack of acknowledgement had been an oversight. She waited, watching as Rebecca continued her friendly exchanges with other passengers, oblivious to the small, glowing button above Sarah's seat. Minutes passed before a younger flight attendant named Michael finally approached, smiling apologetically. "Hi there, how can I help you today?" Sarah smiled back, keeping her voice light. "Just a glass of water, please." Michael nodded, turning quickly to retrieve it. But Rebecca intercepted him, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "I'll handle first class," she snapped, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Rebecca turned and faced Sarah, the forced smile returning, though her eyes were cold. "What do you want?" she asked curtly. "Just some water, please," Sarah replied calmly, keeping her expression neutral. Rebecca returned a few minutes later, practically dropping the water bottle on Sarah's tray table with a disinterested flick of her wrist. As she turned to leave, Sarah heard her mutter just loudly enough, "These people always trying to sit where they don't belong." The words hung in the air like a sour note, and Sarah felt a surge of heat in her chest. Around her, other passengers shifted uncomfortably. A businessman across the aisle halted his typing, his mouth slightly open in shock. A woman a few rows ahead twisted around in her seat, her eyebrows knitted in discomfort. Sarah's hand tightened around the water bottle. Discrimination wasn't new to her, she had encountered it far too many times in her career. But there was something especially abrasive about the boldness with which Rebecca had displayed her disdain. Sarah knew that for every person of color with the resources and status to challenge such behavior, there were countless others who faced this treatment in silence, with no one to listen, no recourse. Sarah took a deep breath, Slipping her phone from her pocket, she typed a few words into her notes app. Her fingers swift and precise, capturing the details. Flight 2317 to San Francisco. Incident with senior flight attendant Rebecca Mills. These people always trying to sit where they don't belong. Her mind sharpened. Years of navigating corporate challenges clicking into place as she began to form a plan. Sarah looked out the window at the bustling runway, thinking of all the people who had endured situations like this, small humiliations, subtle exclusions. In the cold silence of her seat, she knew that this flight wasn't going to end with a simple complaint. She opened her notes app and began to type again, the words flowing easily. Project Sky Change, Phase 1. The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 2317 leveled off at 35,000 feet. Around Sarah, the first-class passengers settled into their routines. Some flipped open newspapers, while others leaned back, ready for a few hours of shut-eye. Sarah returned to her laptop, fingers dancing across the keyboard as she combed through the quarterly reports of Sire's Shield Technologies. But despite her focus, a chill gnawed at her. The air conditioning was blasting, and she wrapped her arms around herself, glancing at the other passengers. Each one had a neatly folded blanket draped over their laps, courtesy of Rebecca Mills. Sarah pressed her call button again, her thumb lingering a second longer as if to punctuate her request. This time, Rebecca's reaction was immediate. She looked over, her mouth tightening as she noticed the glowing button above Sarah's seat. Reluctantly, Rebecca strode over, her heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. Yes? Rebecca's voice was sharp, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes flicked dismissively over Sarah, betraying a simmering disdain. Sarah kept her tone measured. Could I please have a blanket? It's a bit cold. A smirk crept across Rebecca's face, and she leaned in, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Oh, I'm sorry, she began, each word dripping with sarcasm. The blankets in first class are reserved for our regular passengers. She lingered on the word, regular, her gaze traveling slowly from Sarah's head to her toes, as though assessing her worth. For a brief moment, silence filled the cabin, thick and charged. Then a businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, staring in open disbelief. A teenage girl in the front row discreetly pulled out her phone. The screen tilted just enough to catch Rebecca's face. Sarah drew a steady breath, her hands steady despite the tension gripping her body. I am a regular passenger, she replied evenly, her gaze unwavering. In fact, I fly this route twice a month. Rebecca's face twisted in a barely concealed sneer. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was still loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Listen here, she said, a dangerous gleam in her eye. I don't know how you got into this section, but we both know you don't belong here. Maybe you got lucky with an upgrade, but that doesn't mean you can demand first-class treatment. The businessman across the aisle couldn't hold back any longer. Excuse me, he interjected, his voice cold with disgust. That's completely inappropriate. Rebecca straightened up, quickly pasting on her practiced smile. Sir, I'm simply explaining our policy to this passenger, she said, her tone saccharine. But then, under her breath and still loud enough for the entire row to hear, she added, these people always want special treatment. Probably used a stolen credit card for the ticket. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. A woman 2 rows back stood up, phone in hand, her voice shaking with anger. I'm recording all of this, she announced, holding her phone up. This is absolutely unacceptable. Sarah remained composed, her face a mask of calm despite the turmoil inside her. She had weathered prejudice before, had built her company while swimming against currents of doubt and bias. But this was different, a humiliation so bold, so public. It felt as though Rebecca was intent on making an example of her. Sarah reached for her phone, hands steady, her mind crystal clear. Years of experience had taught her that emotions rarely achieve the best results, strategy did. Opening her banking app, she moved a substantial sum of money, swiftly enough to feel its weight in the way her future was being rewritten in real time. Then, she sent a quick text to her executive team. Initialize Protocol Delta. Full report to follow. She allowed herself one deep breath, feeling the shift in her focus. Her entire being preparing for a much larger fight. Rebecca returned, practically throwing a blanket onto Sarah's tray with a bitter scowl. There, she sneered. Happy now? As she stormed off. An elderly Asian woman a few rows back caught Sarah's eye. She did the same thing to me last month. The woman said softly. I wanted to say something. But I was afraid. Sarah nodded, understanding the woman's hesitation all too well. There were countless others who had likely endured Rebecca's disdain in silence, without the means to challenge her. In that moment, Sarah knew, this was bigger than her. It was time to confront not just one flight attendant's prejudice but an entire culture that allowed it to fester. She opened her tablet and created a new file titled Operation Sky Justice. Methodically, she documented every detail, the exact words Rebecca had used, the startled reactions of the other passengers, the conversations she overheard. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned over and handed her a business card. James Morrison, he introduced himself, his voice filled with calm assurance. I'm a civil rights attorney. If you need a witness statement, I'm more than happy to provide one. Sarah accepted his card with a small, appreciative smile. There was no need to reveal her identity just yet. There was something empowering about being underestimated. Sarah glanced around, seeing other passengers recording on their phones, each of them allies without even knowing her story. She saw Michael, the younger flight attendant, watching Rebecca with a troubled expression. With a small nod, she signaled to him that she was all right. Knowing his presence alone was an act of quiet defiance against Rebecca's blatant prejudice. As the flight continued, Sarah's tablet screen glowed with notes, contacts, and a rapidly growing plan of action. Sky Justice was no longer a mere idea, it was an operation. And Sarah was prepared to see it through to the end. Somewhere between the clouds and the calm hum of the engines, Sarah Chen knew she was on the precipice of something transformative. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was about to stand up for everyone who had ever been dismissed, marginalized, or silenced. This was only the beginning. As the plane sailed above the Pacific, the cabin lights dimmed, casting shadows over the drowsing first-class passengers. But Sarah Chen was wide awake, her mind a precise, humming machine of ideas and intentions. Around her, the quiet murmur of conversations drifted. She could feel the other passengers glancing her way, watching her with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Their silent support was palpable. And she knew she wasn't alone in this. Rebecca Mills had retreated to the galley, her cold, arrogant demeanor fading from sight. Sarah's focus was now on something much bigger. Her fingers moved swiftly over her tablet as she opened a new document titled Project Sky Change. Notes and Evidence. Here, she captured every detail from the moment she'd arrived at the gate to Rebecca's thinly veiled insults. This was no longer a private matter, it was a calculated response to an endemic problem that needed exposure. Suddenly, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to find the elderly Asian woman from earlier, the one who'd shared her story of a similar encounter. The woman gave a gentle smile, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that spoke of years of silent endurance. I'm Mei Jiang, she introduced herself, her voice laced with an accent that only enhanced her quiet dignity. I fly this route every month for work. That woman Rebecca, she's done this to me, too. And not just me. I've seen her do it to others. May's hands trembled slightly as she handed Sarah her phone. I didn't know what to do with this, she murmured. The screen showed a gallery of video clips, each one a captured moment of Rebecca's dismissive, often cruel treatment of passengers who didn't fit the mold of her regular clientele. Thank you, Sarah said, her voice steady. You're not alone anymore. She transferred the files to her device, feeling the weight of each recorded moment solidify her resolve. As May returned to her seat, another passenger approached. It was the businessman across the aisle, James Morrison, the civil rights attorney who had spoken up earlier. He leaned over, his voice low but resolute. What happened here is textbook discrimination, he said, passing Sarah a folded piece of paper. Inside were his contact details and a brief summary of what he'd witnessed. I'd be happy to testify. People like Rebecca thrive because nobody stands up to them. This time, I'll make sure she's held accountable. Sarah nodded, grateful, and added his testimony to her growing file. She felt a renewed surge of confidence. Bit by bit, she was assembling the pieces of something powerful. For every person who had been wronged, this was the beginning of change. Moments later, the younger flight attendant, Michael, approached her, glancing around to ensure Rebecca was out of earshot. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Most of us aren't like her. She's been like this for years. But nobody does anything. It's almost as if she's untouchable. Michael's gaze was earnest, and Sarah sensed that he had his own story to tell. She's driven out at least 3 flight attendants of color in the last year alone. He continued, his voice tight with frustration. I've tried to report her behavior. But every complaint vanishes. She's got connections high up. Sarah's jaw clenched slightly. Who's protecting her? Her cousin, Michael said with a hint of bitterness. Thomas Williams Jr., the airline's VP of Human Resources. He's been covering for her since the beginning. Nobody dares to cross him. Sarah nodded, understanding. This was bigger than she had anticipated. Rebecca wasn't simply one rogue employee, she was part of a larger, festering problem that stretched all the way up the chain of command. Sarah made a note. Investigate management cover-ups. Particularly Thomas Williams Jr. She glanced up at Michael. Her expression softened. Thank you, Michael. Your courage matters. Relieved, Michael gave her a small, grateful smile before returning to his duties. Sarah resumed typing on her tablet, capturing every detail he'd shared. Her evidence file was growing by the minute, transforming from a simple complaint into a comprehensive investigation. As Sarah worked, she received a ping from her phone, an email from her legal team with the subject line, "Initial research complete." She opened it and scanned the message, her eyes narrowing as she read. The email confirmed what she had already suspected. The airline had a history of discriminatory practices. In the past 2 years alone, 127 complaints had been filed and then quietly dismissed. Settlements had been issued, but nothing had changed. Sarah's lips pressed into a determined line. This was no longer about a single flight, this was about reshaping an entire industry. Across the aisle, James Morrison observed her with an approving nod. You're onto something big, aren't you? He asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had fought similar battles before. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze. I am, she replied, the conviction clear in her voice. This isn't going to end with Rebecca. It's going all the way to the top. As the plane continued its journey toward San Francisco, Sarah's focus never wavered. She drafted emails to her legal and financial teams, instructing them to dig deeper. She wanted records, every disciplinary file, every resolved case, every complaint that had been swept under the rug. She sent messages to her closest advisors, activating a protocol she'd only used once before, Protocol Delta, a discrete plan for rapid, strategic acquisition. With each passing minute, Operation Sky Justice took on a life of its own, evolving into a meticulously crafted plan. This wouldn't just be a warning to the airline, it would be a wake-up call for the entire industry. Around her, the passengers in first class settled back into their routines, unaware that a quiet revolution was unfolding in seat 2A. But Sarah could feel the weight of their silent support, the subtle nods and the sympathetic smiles. They, too, had witnessed the injustice, and they were willing to stand with her. As the plane began its descent, Sarah leaned back, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the clouds outside her window. This was no longer just a flight. It was the beginning of a transformation, one that would ensure no one ever had to endure what she and others had faced. This fight would not end when they landed. It was only just beginning. As the wheels of Flight 2317 touched down in San Francisco, Sarah Chen felt a resolve settle within her as solid as the earth beneath her. The familiar chaos of disembarking was a blur around her. Passengers reached for overhead bags, stretched from their seats, and filled the aisles. But Sarah moved with purpose, each step an anchor for the quiet storm building within her. In the terminal, her assistant, Lisa, was waiting, her face serious and her stride brisk as she approached. We've gathered the preliminary data you asked for, Ms. Chen, Lisa said in a hushed tone. sliding an encrypted tablet into Sarah's hands. It's disturbing. Good. The more we know, the stronger our case, Sarah replied. Is the team ready? Lisa nodded. They're on standby, and they've begun analyzing the discrimination complaints and internal documents we could access. They walked through the terminal, weaving through crowds of passengers. Sarah glanced down at the tablet, scanning the files Lisa had compiled. Each document was more damning than the last. Records of settlements. Internal communications dismissing discrimination complaints as misunderstandings, and emails from Thomas Williams Jr., the VP of Human Resources and Rebecca's cousin, who had a history of silencing complaints against her. In the privacy of her car, Sarah tapped through the files, her vision expanding beyond the isolated incidents she'd experienced firsthand. This was systemic, a tangled web of protection and prejudice woven through the company's upper echelons. The documents told a harrowing story. Over the past 5 years, there had been hundreds of complaints filed against Rebecca Mills and other employees for discriminatory actions against passengers and staff of color. Each complaint had been neatly tucked away, effectively erased under Williams's watchful eye. The deeper Sarah dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't an anomaly but a standard operating procedure. We need more than this, she said to Lisa, her voice steady but with a sharpened edge. Dig deeper into the corporate structure. I want to know who else has been protecting her and everyone involved. Lisa nodded, making notes as Sarah continued. Contact every legal team member. I want affidavits, witness statements, any supporting documents from employees who were forced to resign or paid to stay silent. As they reached the Sires Shield headquarters, Sarah's personal investigation team awaited her in the glass-walled conference room on the top floor. David Park, her head investigator, slid a thick stack of files across the table as she took her seat. Ms. Chen, we've found a pattern, David began, his tone grave. It stretches back 7 years. And it's not just Rebecca. The airline's culture is riddled with this behavior. We're seeing evidence of cover-ups, settlements paid under strict NDAs, and records of countless minority employees forced out under suspicious circumstances. Sarah scanned the top document, her fingers tracing the list of names, people who had been silenced, pushed out, or bought off to keep the culture intact. Anger rose within her, a steady and controlled flame. This was exactly why people like Rebecca felt entitled to discriminate. The system was designed to protect them. Thomas Williams Jr., she asked. Looking up, David nodded. He's been a key player. We found emails from him personally intervening in cases involving Rebecca. He's responsible for dismissing over half of the complaints filed against her. Sarah took a deep breath, setting her jaw. This is bigger than a simple complaint. We're exposing a corporate culture that not only enables but encourages discriminatory practices. It's time to raise the stakes. She called in her CFO, Janet Wong, who entered with her own folder. The airline's stock is vulnerable. Ms. Chen, Janet said, their profit margins are thin, and they're overextended on certain routes. A strategic acquisition is feasible. Sarah's mind worked quickly, calculating the potential for influence and reform. Then we begin, she said, her voice resolute. Use our subsidiary firms to start purchasing shares quietly. I don't want anyone connecting this back to Sires Shield until we're ready. Janet nodded, noting each directive carefully. I'll coordinate the purchases so we stay under reporting thresholds. This will give us a significant influence without drawing early attention. Sarah leaned back, her gaze steady. Good. Let's keep the market calm. But if they push back, we go public with every single piece of evidence. We won't just change this airline, we'll create a new standard for the industry. A silence settled over the room as her team processed the gravity of her words. David looked up, admiration gleaming in his eyes. You're planning something bigger than a lawsuit, he said quietly. This is an overhaul. Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just a determination that radiated from her core. It's time the world saw the cost of silence, she said. We're going to make them choose between accountability and collapse. Lisa returned with an update. They had already contacted a handful of former employees who had been discriminated against and silenced. One of them was on her way to meet with the team. Sarah glanced at her watch. This wasn't just an investigation, it was becoming a movement. Minutes later, a woman named Rachel Nguyen entered the room. Her expression tentative yet hopeful. Rachel, a former flight attendant, had left the airline years ago after relentless harassment and isolation. Sarah listened as Rachel shared her story, her hands shaking as she recounted the countless times she'd been ignored, reprimanded, and ultimately forced out by Rebecca. "They made me feel like I was the problem," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "I wanted to stay, I loved the job. But they kept piling on the criticisms, making my life miserable until I quit." David took detailed notes, and Sarah reached across the table, her gaze holding Rachel's. "You were never the problem," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "The problem was a culture that allowed this to happen. And it's going to change." Rachel's eyes glistened with tears as she nodded, relief washing over her. Thank you for not letting this go." When she left, Sarah turned to her team, her voice resolute. "Compile every story. We'll use this in our negotiations. If they refuse reform, we'll make sure the public knows exactly who they are." As the day wore on, more former employees, attorneys, and even a few current flight attendants came forward, each one contributing another piece to the intricate puzzle of negligence and cover-ups. Sarah's case was no longer just an effort for personal justice, it was a battle for every employee and passenger who had suffered in silence. By evening, Sarah stood by the vast windows of her office, the city lights of San Francisco glittering below her. Her tablet held a dossier thick with evidence, a collection of lives interrupted by prejudice and protected by power. Tomorrow, the airline's board would feel the tremors of her investigation. This was no longer about one rude flight attendant, it was about uprooting a toxic legacy. Turning back to her team, Sarah raised her voice, her words carrying the force of her resolve. "Prepare everything for tomorrow's briefing. This is the beginning of something much larger. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for change for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." She watched as her team nodded in silent agreement, their faces a blend of focus and pride. They were ready, and so was she. The sun rose over downtown San Francisco, casting a warm, golden glow over the Sire's Shield Tower. Inside, the top-floor conference room was a hive of activity as Sarah Chen's team prepared for what could be the most pivotal board meeting in the airline's history. In a few short hours, Sarah would confront the board members and unveil the evidence she had meticulously gathered, a collection of complaints, settlements, and silenced testimonies that would expose the toxic culture they had allowed to thrive. As Sarah scanned the final dossier, she took a deep breath. The documents detailed years of buried complaints, evidence of manipulation by Thomas Williams Jr., and internal memos that spoke to a systematic protection of discriminatory practices. Today, her mission was clear: confront the board, initiate a takeover, and dismantle the old system from the inside out. At exactly 10 a.m., Sarah and her team strode into the airline's headquarters, their steps confident and deliberate. Every head turned as they entered the building, staff and executives alike unable to look away from the figure who had become something of an enigma: Sarah Chen. The woman whose technology empire had reshaped cybersecurity, now poised to take on an airline. Inside the luxurious boardroom on the 30th floor, the board members waited, seated in a neat row around a polished mahogany table. Thomas Williams Sr., the CEO, sat at the head of the table with a confident smile, flanked by his son, Thomas Williams Jr., the VP of Human Resources and Rebecca's protective cousin. They were both unaware of the storm about to descend. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah greeted, her voice calm and firm as she took her seat at the opposite end of the table. Her team arranged themselves on either side of her, each of them carrying a thick binder of evidence. Thomas Sr. cleared his throat, his smile faltering as he noted the formal atmosphere. "Ms. Chen, to what do we owe the pleasure of this unexpected meeting?" he asked, glancing at his son, who looked equally uneasy. Sarah didn't waste a moment. "I believe you've all read this morning's announcement," she began, her voice cutting through the silence. "Sire's Shield Technologies now holds a 67.3% stake in this airline, making me the majority shareholder." A ripple of shock moved across the table as the board members exchanged nervous glances. Thomas Jr. frantically opened his phone, scrolling through the morning news with a look of horror. "That's impossible," he stammered, his face pale. "We would have known." Sarah's assistant, Lisa, slid thick binders across the table to each board member. "The documents confirm our ownership," Lisa said, her tone unyielding. "These binders also contain records that you may find enlightening." As the board members began flipping through the pages, their expressions darkened. Page after page, they saw photos, videos, emails, and testimonies, all meticulously catalogued instances of discriminatory behavior swept under the rug. Rebecca's offenses alone filled an entire section of the dossier, detailing over 200 complaints dismissed by Thomas Jr. "This," Thomas Sr. began, his voice shaky, "this is completely unprecedented." Sarah leaned forward, her gaze cold and unwavering. "Unprecedented is exactly what happens when employees feel empowered to abuse their authority without consequence. This airline has fostered a culture that protects discrimination rather than addressing it." The silence was broken by the faint click of the door opening. Rebecca Mills entered, wearing her flight attendant uniform, a smirk tugging at her lips until she saw Sarah seated at the head of the table, surrounded by the board. You're the woman from Flight 2317. Rebecca stammered, her expression one of shock and confusion. "That's right," Sarah replied coolly, her gaze steady. "The woman you said didn't belong in first class. The one you suspected of using a stolen credit card. And as it turns out, the one who now owns this airline." Rebecca's face drained of color as she looked around, realizing that her allies, including her cousin Thomas Jr., were avoiding her gaze. "Let's begin, shall we?" Sarah continued, standing up and gesturing to the screen behind her. A slideshow of video evidence flickered to life, a montage of Rebecca's discriminatory treatment toward passengers and staff. Each clip showed a new angle, each incident a new level of disdain and entitlement. "Ms. Mills," Sarah said, turning to Rebecca, "you have two options. Option 1. Immediate termination. Effective today. Option 2. A full course of sensitivity training. Supervised closely. You'll work under a restructured team with zero tolerance for any further behavior like what we see here." Rebecca's gaze shifted to Thomas Jr., searching for support. But he merely looked away, his own career hanging by a thread. Rebecca's voice cracked, all of her arrogance fading. "I'll take the training." "Good choice," Sarah replied, her voice firm, "because this isn't about punishing you. It's about transforming this airline." With that, she turned back to the board members. "Effective immediately. Every single one of you is dismissed," Sarah declared, her tone final. "Your positions will be filled by leaders who understand that diversity and respect are core values, not optional policies." Thomas Sr. rose to his feet, his face red with anger. "You can't do this. I built this company. My family, your family," Sarah cut him off, "has failed the very people it was meant to serve. You've hidden behind excuses and ignored voices crying out for justice. Today, that ends." One by one, the board members filed out, their faces grim as they passed Rebecca, who stood alone in the corner. Sarah's new team entered, carrying fresh binders and documents labeled "New Policies and Initiatives." Charts showcasing diversity initiatives covered the walls, setting the stage for a complete overhaul of the airline's internal culture. Rebecca watched silently from her corner as the room transformed around her. She looked smaller, her once confident smirk replaced by a look of uncertainty. For years, she had treated passengers and colleagues alike with scorn, secure in the knowledge that her cousin would protect her. Now, she stood alone, realizing for the first time the gravity of her actions. "Ms. Mills," Sarah said, her tone firm but with a note of unexpected kindness. "Your sensitivity training begins tomorrow at 9 a.m. Don't be late." Rebecca nodded, her head bowed as she left the room. Sarah watched her go, knowing that this was just the first of many steps toward real, lasting change. Turning back to her team, Sarah gave a nod. "Begin distributing the new policies. Make sure every employee understands that we're establishing a zero-tolerance stance against discrimination." From the ground crew to the boardroom, the team moved quickly, setting new standards and ushering in a fresh chapter for the airline. A chapter where every passenger, every employee, would be respected and valued. As the day drew to a close, Sarah glanced out the boardroom window, watching the planes glide across the runway against a sky painted with the fading light of sunset. This wasn't just a corporate takeover. It was the beginning of an industry-wide revolution. And Sarah Chen, the woman once underestimated in first class, was now leading the charge. It had been 2 weeks since Sarah Chen's decisive takeover, and the airline's headquarters buzzed with a new, frenetic energy. The boardroom on the 30th floor, once the domain of complacency, was now a command center for transformation. Chart after chart covered the walls, each outlining diversity initiatives, corporate restructuring, and customer experience improvements. Sarah stood in the center of it all, her presence magnetic and commanding, as her team worked tirelessly around her. The first major program Sarah had rolled out was called the Sky Equality Initiative. Every employee, from pilots to ground staff, would now undergo mandatory diversity and sensitivity training. The sessions were designed to be more than just corporate rhetoric. Sarah wanted them to be immersive and impactful. The initiative included virtual reality experiences, where employees could walk in the shoes of those who had experienced discrimination, feeling the frustration, fear, and helplessness they had endured. Sarah observed the training from the back of the room as Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a renowned expert in corporate diversity, led the sessions. Today's session covered unconscious bias, and Sarah watched as the employees, many of whom had never considered the deep impact of subtle biases, began to look introspective. Some appeared uncomfortable, others thoughtful, but all were engaged. At the front of the room sat Rebecca Mills, no longer wearing her sharp uniform, but instead seated with the other employees. Her posture slumped, a mix of regret and discomfort etched on her face. For years, Rebecca had seen herself as the enforcer of standards, the gatekeeper of exclusivity, but now, with her peers around her, she appeared small. Her usual arrogance faded. Dr. Rodriguez was telling a story about her own experiences with prejudice when Rebecca raised her hand, surprising even herself. I never thought of it that way," Rebecca admitted, her voice hesitant. "I thought I was upholding quality. But now, seeing the faces and hearing the voices of people I've hurt, I realize I was only hurting myself too." Sarah watched as the room held its breath. Rebecca's vulnerability created a ripple effect, and others around her shared their own stories of biases they had never before confronted. Rebecca's admission marked a turning point. She was no longer the defiant gatekeeper, she was someone willing to learn. And for the first time, she was beginning to grow. By the end of the day, Rebecca approached Sarah, a new humility in her eyes. "I just wanted to say, thank you. I didn't realize how blind I was to my own behavior. This has changed me." Sarah nodded, offering a small but encouraging smile. "True change doesn't happen overnight, Rebecca. It's a journey. You can be a part of this transformation, or you can let it pass you by. The choice is yours." Rebecca gave a resolute nod. "I want to be part of it. I need to be." As Rebecca walked away, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. If even someone as resistant as Rebecca could change, then perhaps the entire company could be reshaped. Meanwhile, the impact of Sarah's reforms extended far beyond the training room. The First Class for All initiative had gone into effect, replacing the vague and often prejudiced criteria for upgrades with a purely merit-based points system. News of the changes spread quickly, and social media buzzed with passengers sharing stories of respectful treatment and fair policies. At a staff meeting later that week, Michael, the young flight attendant who had first confided in Sarah, was introduced as the new head of the Employee Voice Committee. His first act was to unveil an anonymous reporting system that allowed employees to submit complaints of bias or misconduct without fear of retaliation. Standing at the podium, Michael's voice carried a renewed sense of confidence. "This is for every employee who's ever felt unheard, every passenger who's been made to feel like they don't belong," he said. "Together, we're changing this airline, one flight at a time." Applause filled the room, and for a moment, Sarah could see the transformation unfolding in real time. The employees' faces were alight with pride and purpose. Even the quiet ones in the back seemed to sit a little taller. their eyes filled with the hope that the company they worked for was finally aligning with their own values. Throughout the building, new protocols were being established, each aimed at creating a culture of accountability and empathy. Every call button was answered promptly. Every passenger greeted with a smile. Regardless of appearance, it was as though a veil had lifted, allowing a sense of unity to settle over the airline's team. Yet, the transformation wasn't just felt internally. Externally, passengers noticed the shift as well. Customer satisfaction scores began to rise, with praise flooding in from passengers who had experienced the airline's renewed focus on respect and equality. The media quickly picked up on the story, dubbing it the Sky Revolution. And Sarah found herself at the center of a cultural shift that was rippling across the aviation industry. One day, as Sarah reviewed the latest data with her team, she received an unexpected visitor, Mei Zhang, the elderly woman who had first shared her story on that pivotal flight. Ms. Chen, Mei greeted her with a warm smile, holding a stack of letters. These are from people I know, people who faced discrimination like I did. I thought you might want to read them. Sarah accepted the letters, her heart swelling with gratitude. Mei's bravery had been a catalyst. And now, seeing her here, Sarah felt the full weight of her responsibility. This wasn't just about one airline, it was about every person who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or silenced. Thank you, Mei, Sarah said, her voice steady. You were one of the first to stand with me. This change is as much yours as it is mine. Mei gave a humble nod. Sometimes, it just takes one person willing to listen. As the two women exchanged a silent understanding, Sarah knew that her mission was only just beginning. Her reforms would lay the groundwork, but the heart of the transformation would be in the everyday actions of her team. The passengers, and everyone who had decided to be part of something bigger. Leaving the conference room that evening, Sarah felt a rare sense of peace. She watched as employees moved through the hallways with a newfound sense of pride and purpose. And she knew that her decision to step into this fight was more than justified. This was no longer about reclaiming her dignity, it was about creating a world where dignity was a given. The revolution had begun, and as Sarah looked around, she knew there was no turning back. 1 month into the transformation, the airline had become a different entity altogether. What had once been a place where bias thrived unchecked was now a model for fairness, respect, and inclusivity. Sarah's reforms had swept through every level of the organization, reaching the heart of what it meant to work for and fly with the airline. Inside the airline's newly designed training center, employees participated in a full-day workshop focused on cultural sensitivity, customer service excellence, and personal growth. The workshops included interactive exercises, real-life case studies, and even testimonials from passengers who had previously experienced discrimination. At the heart of these workshops, seated in the front row with a notebook in hand, was Rebecca Mills. Rebecca's transformation had become one of the most unexpected and inspiring parts of the company's overhaul. Every day, she sat with other employees, listening, absorbing, and unlearning years of ingrained prejudice. Her once hard-edged demeanor had softened, she engaged fully, and sometimes even stood up to share her own journey with others. Today, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, the corporate diversity expert, invited Rebecca to speak. Standing before her peers, Rebecca took a deep breath, visibly nervous but determined. I'm not proud of who I was, she began, her voice carrying a vulnerability that surprised everyone. For so many years, I thought I was protecting the airline's standards. I thought that by keeping things exclusive, I was doing my job. But I was wrong. I was blinded by my own biases. And in doing so, I hurt people who deserved so much better. There was a quiet stillness in the room, each person listening intently. Rebecca's eyes filled with remorse as she continued. This training, these stories, it's changed me. I've learned that respect isn't about who belongs or who doesn't. It's about honoring each person as they are, without prejudice. I'm sorry to anyone I hurt, and I want to spend the rest of my career making things right. Applause filled the room, not out of obligation but out of genuine respect for the vulnerability Rebecca had shown. Sarah, who had been observing from the back, felt a glimmer of satisfaction. Rebecca's redemption was proof that real change was possible. even for those who had resisted it the hardest. The First Class for All initiative had also brought a radical shift in passenger experience. With clear, unbiased criteria for upgrades, passengers from all backgrounds were finding themselves in first class, treated with the respect and warmth that was now becoming synonymous with the airline. Social media buzzed with stories of inclusive treatment, shared by passengers who felt seen, respected, and valued. One of these passengers was Mei Zhang, who had become a frequent traveler with the airline. On a recent flight, she was not only greeted by name but escorted to her seat by a newly trained flight attendant who offered her extra blankets and a warm smile. Mei had written Sarah a letter, thanking her for the changes that had made a once hostile environment a welcoming one. At the airline's headquarters, Sarah's new management team was also seeing the financial benefits of her reforms. Customer satisfaction scores had skyrocketed, and the airline's social media presence had transformed from a liability into a powerhouse of positive testimonials. Janet Wang, the new HR director, shared the latest reports with Sarah one afternoon. Our customer complaints are down by 70%, and employee satisfaction scores have gone up by 45%. Janet reported with a smile. Booking rates have increased by 25%, and we're trending as the most inclusive airline. We're setting an industry standard. Sarah studied the charts, her heart swelling with pride. We're showing that respect and dignity aren't just moral choices, they're good business. Meanwhile, Michael, the young flight attendant who had first reached out to Sarah, had risen to a new role as Vice President of Employee Relations. One of his first initiatives was to create the Voice of Change program, an anonymous platform for reporting discrimination and misconduct. Employees could now speak freely without fear of retaliation, knowing their concerns would be addressed. The program was a success from the start. Incidents of bias were swiftly addressed, and employees who had once felt silenced now had a channel through which they could advocate for themselves and others. The effects were immediate, with improved morale and a newfound sense of unity among the crew. One evening, Sarah received a message from James Morrison, the civil rights attorney she had met on that fateful flight. He was flying first class on a recent trip, and his message was filled with praise. Sarah, he wrote, the change is astounding. The staff were welcoming, attentive, and respectful to every passenger. You've done something truly remarkable. Thank you for making a difference. Sarah leaned back, a warm smile spreading across her face. This was the kind of change she had envisioned, a culture of dignity that radiated outward, from the heart of the airline to every flight and every passenger. As the month drew to a close, the airline hosted a company-wide celebration in recognition of their achievements. Employees from all departments gathered in the hangar, a space transformed with lights, music, and banners emblazoned with the airline's new slogan, "Sky's the limit for everyone." Rebecca stood at the podium, her hands shaking slightly as she looked out at the crowd. In her hand, she held a stack of letters, thank you notes from passengers who had experienced her changed behavior firsthand. I used to think that change was for other people, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But I've learned that change starts here, with each of us. To those of you who believed in me and gave me a second chance. Thank you. To Ms. Chen, who challenged us to be better. Thank you. Rebecca's speech was met with cheers, her colleagues clapping not just for her words but for the journey she had undertaken. For the first time, she felt as though she belonged, not because she was protecting some arbitrary standard, but because she had learned to truly respect others. As the celebration wound down, Sarah stood off to the side, watching as employees laughed, shared stories, and embraced. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Mei, who smiled warmly. You've given people hope, Mei said softly. Thank you for making this place somewhere I want to fly. Sarah's heart swelled. Mei's quiet resilience had been one of the sparks that lit this transformation, and her gratitude was a reminder of the power of standing up, even when it's uncomfortable. Thank you, Mei, Sarah replied. You were the first to show me how much this mattered. As the festivities continued, Sarah knew that this was more than a company celebration. It was the start of a movement. Other airlines had begun adopting similar diversity initiatives, and Sarah's company had become a model for fairness and inclusion across the industry. What began as a single flight marred by prejudice had evolved into a revolution. In the days that followed, the Sky Revolution gained national attention. Industry publications highlighted the airline's transformation, and competitors scrambled to keep up. Sarah's story and the airline's success became a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of accountability, empathy, and the courage to change. That evening, Sarah returned to her office and gazed out at the San Francisco skyline. She could see the lights of planes taking off in the distance, each one carrying passengers who would feel the impact of what she had built. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. This wasn't just a win for her, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. 1 year had passed since Sarah Chen had first boarded Flight 2317. A journey that had sparked an upheaval in the airline industry and ignited what the media now called the Sky Justice movement. In her office high above San Francisco, Sarah reviewed the year's progress report with a sense of pride that was deeper than any corporate success she'd ever known. The results were staggering. The airline's profits had soared by 85%, a testament to the loyalty they had cultivated among a diverse, grateful customer base. What had started as an intervention to correct internal prejudice had blossomed into a sweeping transformation. Now, airlines around the world were adopting versions of Sarah's Sky Equality Program and First Class for All initiatives. The once dubious industry giants were racing to keep up, implementing changes that had once been dismissed as impossible. Final numbers are in, Ms. Chen, announced Janet Wang, now Director of Human Resources and a pivotal player in Sarah's reform plan. She placed a thick report on Sarah's desk, her smile bright with pride. 0 discrimination complaints in the past 6 months. Employee satisfaction is at 98%. Customer loyalty has increased by 200%. And we've been named the most inclusive airline for 3 quarters in a row. As Sarah flipped through the report, she saw statistics, testimonials, and stories from employees and passengers whose lives had been changed by the movement. Each page felt like a testament to the power of standing up and choosing to do what was right, even when the stakes were high. One of the most compelling success stories in the report belonged to Rebecca Mills. Once the airline's most notorious flight attendant, Rebecca had now become its most vocal advocate for inclusivity. Promoted to Global Director of Diversity Training, she was traveling worldwide, sharing her story at industry conferences, training workshops, and leadership seminars. Her speeches, once filled with scripted formalities, were now filled with humility, honesty, and an unmistakable fire for justice. Today, Rebecca is delivering a speech in London. Janet mentioned, pulling up a live video feed on Sarah's laptop. On the screen, Sarah watched as Rebecca stood on stage in front of an audience of airline executives from across the globe. Rebecca's voice was steady, filled with conviction. "I was the problem," she said openly, her eyes scanning the room. "I represented everything that was wrong with our industry. But thanks to someone who chose education over revenge, I learned to become part of the solution. If I can change, anyone can." The audience erupted in applause, and Sarah felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. Rebecca's transformation had been a powerful example of what was possible when people were given a chance to confront their biases and grow beyond them. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from James Morrison, the civil rights attorney who had stood up for her on that pivotal flight. "Just flew first class." The message read, "The change is remarkable. Thank you for making this happen." The ripple effect of her efforts had extended far beyond her airline. Across the industry, complaints of discrimination had dropped by 70%, while diverse hiring practices had increased by 45%. Social media was flooded with stories from passengers who felt welcomed and respected, their experiences shattering the stereotypes that had once been the unspoken rule. Back in her office, Sarah gathered her team for an announcement. As they settled around the table, she looked at each of them, their faces reflecting the dedication they had poured into this journey. "Today, we're establishing the Aviation Equality Foundation," she began, her voice filled with resolve. "This foundation will provide grants and resources to help other airlines implement similar changes. Our goal is to make sure that our success isn't just ours, it's the standard for everyone." The room filled with murmurs of excitement. Michael, the young flight attendant who had first confided in her, now the airline's vice president of employee relations, wiped a tear from his eye. He had grown into a leader, spearheading initiatives like the Voice of Change program, which allowed employees to report incidents of discrimination safely and anonymously. Sarah, he began, voice breaking slightly, you've not only changed this airline, you've changed my life. I didn't believe things could get better. I never thought anyone would actually listen. Sarah nodded, touched by his words. You were one of the first to stand up. Michael, your courage inspired this. We wouldn't be here without you. As the team dispersed to begin their work on the new foundation, Sarah took a moment to herself. She gazed out the window at the tarmac below, where planes were taking off and landing in a rhythm that felt both timeless and new. Among those planes was Flight 2317, now rebranded as the Equality Flight, a symbolic tribute to the journey that had started it all. Later that afternoon, Mei Jiang, the elderly woman whose quiet bravery had ignited Sarah's resolve, arrived at Sarah's office. She was now chairperson of the airline's Passenger Advisory Board, a position Sarah had offered her with the hope that she would guide future policies. You've done something amazing, Sarah, Mei said, her voice warm and gentle. I've never seen people treated with so much respect. This airline, it's a place where we all feel at home now. Sarah took Mei's hand, a quiet gratitude passing between them. This change belongs to all of us. Mei, thank you for sharing your story. It started everything. A week later, the airline hosted a grand celebration at San Francisco International Airport to honor the one-year anniversary of the transformation. Employees, passengers, partners, and media gathered in the newly designed terminal, where a large banner hung, taking flight together. Rebecca Mills stood at the podium, flanked by Sarah and the new board of directors. Rebecca addressed the crowd, her voice steady and filled with conviction. 1 year ago, I was a different person, a person who hurt others because of my own ignorance and prejudice. But thanks to Ms. Chen's vision, I was given a chance to change. I hope my journey can serve as proof that transformation is possible for all of us. Applause filled the terminal, and Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she joined in the clapping. Standing beside Rebecca, Michael, Mei, and the new board members, Sarah realized she had achieved something beyond corporate success. She had built a legacy, one that would ripple through the lives of everyone who walked through the airline's doors, whether they were a passenger or an employee. As the celebration wound down, a reporter approached Sarah, microphone in hand. Ms. Chen, you've not only transformed this airline, but you've inspired an entire industry. What's next for you? Sarah paused, thinking for a moment before responding. What's next? We keep going. The work isn't finished. There are still people who face discrimination, industries that need change, voices that aren't heard. Today is a celebration, but tomorrow, we continue the fight. As Sarah looked around the bustling terminal, watching the smiles and warm exchanges, she knew the revolution she'd started would continue long after she was gone. The airline had become more than a business, it was a movement. One that would lift everyone who stepped into its embrace. A year after that fateful flight, Sarah Chen felt the weight of her journey lift. The legacy of equality, dignity, and transformation was now as much a part of the airline as the planes themselves. Soaring through open skies, carrying not just passengers but the promise of a future where everyone belonged.